The War Within's final patch. Huge stories coming in 2025. Now, we know where the story is going right now with 11.1, even though we haven't played it. It's not a spoiler, but we do know Xal'atath is going to the goblins, specifically Gallywix, to get the heart, what was that thing? That thing fixed, whatever it was called that it broke, okay? She's going to get that thing fixed, and she's going to try to use it again in some way, shape, or form, maybe to bring Demancius about. But the story's about to get big. We know that. It's going to become climactic here. We're heading into midnight, maybe take our first L. Let's see what Belialar has to say about the story going forward here in 2025.
Today you're going to learn what's happening next and why in World of Warcraft. That's because the future of this whole World Soul Saga thing is fairly clear. Soon we're going to go to Undermine, and then it's going to be patch 11.1.5 Nightfall, which very much tips us into the Void arc of this.
To me, 11.1.5 is the kickoff for the Midnight expansion. This is the transitionary patch that's going to take us from the War Within storyline into the Midnight storyline.
Expansion trio, that is what will dominate the Midnight expansion. But before that, something's missing. We're going to have a full major patch before midnight, the final patch of the War Within, 11.2. But that's where it gets weird. There are two story arcs that are barreling towards the conclusion of this expansion. One of them is Orwena and our World Soul, potentially meeting the world.
Orwena of the Horonir. What's she going to do? I think this will be the storyline that plays out towards the end of this expansion. Root lands, get a little bit of old god lore, old god blood, and then here we go. We're heading into midnight. That's probably what will happen.
Soul. On the other hand, though, we've got the Ethereals that may be introducing Midnight's core threat, Demancius.
Yeah, to me, I see Ethereals playing out more in terms of pre-patch for Midnight. That's probably when we'll get Ethereals, maybe playable Ethereals, who knows? But that's how, I think that's the order. We'll get both of these stories. One will be towards the end of this expansion, Orwena, and then the other one will be, okay, kick off to midnight. Here you go. Ethereals are now front and center.
Storylines, two zones, ones that are being developed
I gotta stop pausing,
now
man.
And in
Like a minute
Undermine,
in.
but seemingly only room for one major patch. Take a look at this. It's allegedly a production map of Khazalgar, and if you look closely, you'll see the block counts for zone dimensions with an entry for somewhere that is called the Rootlands.
To me, this is the 11.2 patch. Rootlands is going to be it. We're going to get an opening of the Rootlands, and that's where the Horonir are going to be front and center. Also, maybe they become playable at that point.
And if this map holds up, then, well, we could actually be looking at the Horonir's homeland and a future patch zone for World of Warcraft, which would make sense. As recently as patch 11.0.7, Orwena's companions abandoned her to return to somewhere called the Cradle. And if you're wondering where the Cradle is, we've got a fairly good idea. Check this out. Whenever you fly between Hallowfall and Azj-Kahet, we find these routes. If you fly into the routes, you're just transported to the bottom of the zone with the same drowsy effect that you see whenever you go out of bounds in patch 10.2's Emerald Dream. Of course, if you then connect that...
It's the same thing that happens if you go towards the what's it called? The Crystal and Hallowfall, right? If you head towards Beladar, you get too close to it, the same thing. You kind of fade out and you end up on the beach.
Emerald Dream. Of course, if you then connect that back to all the nature magic that Orwena has been using, it seems pretty clear to me anyway that that is in fact the entrance to her homeland. And that, plus a few other things, are the mountain of evidence that points towards a Horonir zone. Now that's only one of two contenders for our final patch. Let's take a look at the other one. It's called Kesh, or whatever is left of it. Kesh, by the way, is the ethereal homeworld.
I hope we go there.
We'll do more of it later. Unused tooltips have got a tag that says if...
Damn it, the fucking knock. The fucking knock. Scared the shit out of me. Who is that? Burning Viking in the chat. Jesus Christ, Burning. Fucking pause the blorps. Scared. You're going to scare the shit out of everyone on YouTube now. You dick.
So those had been discovered in the game files, which feels a little notable because Goblin raid files were also found, and look where we're going now. We're going to a Goblin zone. So, is there going to be a Ethereal raid in our future? That's at least one shred of data mining evidence that does suggest yes. And if there is to be a raid,
I hope so.
Would it be in an ethereal zone? I mean, the answer there is not necessarily.
We already got an ethereal in the first raid, right? We do the princess one where we do the fight. We don't actually kill her. She ends up leaving us, and she's supposed to be like an assassin placed in the court, right? She kind of weaseled her way in. Yeah, don't be sad. I gained their trust, and eventually we fight her, and she leaves, right? So she's already an ethereal boss fight that we've dealt with. Going forward, going to Kesh. I would love to see it. Seeing what Demancius actually did to their planet in the very end, because that's supposedly the fate of Azeroth if we don't get things turned around and fixed here. The Harbinger, right? Xal'atath. The Ethereals obviously know her. The way that Locust Walker has talked about her, they seem to have a history. So delving into Xal'atath's lore, delving into the end times of Kesh and all that, I think would be some amazing stuff. Could be pre-patch for Midnight, could be first patch at Midnight. We'll have to see whether or not it actually dips a little bit into the War Within.
But take a look at all of these new Ethereal models. These feature pretty heavily in patch 11.1, where we find a new faction of Void Ethereals who don't work for Xal'atath, which is quite the lore conundrum. It's probably the same group, I would say anyway, that have been following us since the Trial of Style in the Brawlers Guild, and we'll do a video on that soon. But the point is, their World Soul arc, that of the Ethereals, is just beginning. And so while the Rootlands do look like the most obvious option, Kesh is certainly possible. The evidence is circumstantial, nothing is solid, but firmly, it is in the good enough category. Which actually leaves us with a bit of a problem. Both of these zones align perfectly with where the War Within and the World Soul saga are going. We've got two major storylines to resolve, two potential zones, but only one patch to do it in. Let's examine both in proper detail.
Well, one patch if you're not including pre-patch for Midnight. If you're going to consider pre-patch for Midnight part of Midnight, then yes, we only got one real patch to dig into this stuff. But to me, you still kind of got two, right? You got the tip of Midnight coming into the War Within. Just the tip.
Okay, so the World Soul is the beating heart of this expansion, and it really is the core of this saga of expansions, hence the name. Now, this expansion began by the World Soul calling to us, drawing us to Silithus, and then telling us exactly where Khazalgar was. When we get to Khazalgar, the deeper and deeper we go, the more we discover that Azeroth is this massive force at the heart of the planet. We learn that the Titans tried to contain her, but that all of that energy just kept leaking out. It even turned some of the Titan Force servants into Thragar. Those Thragar then immediately tried to bust Azeroth out of her Titan-made prison, which was called the World Core. So, that's kind of relevant to the story.
Right.
And when we look at Dornogal, freedom is a major story arc. The Earthen discover that they've got darker, hidden parts to their past. They learn of their ancestors rebelling and basically gain a new perspective on everything that they thought they knew. Then, when we travel deeper, we find Orwena. Her people literally worship the World Soul. I mean, here she is in front of the World Soul. If you remember Magni speaking to the World Soul, right, in the BFA expansion, well, Orwena is essentially the next level of contact there. Her story basically shows us what we're fighting to defend. It helps to make the whole World Soul thing make sense. And it will have to make sense because it's what the whole trio of expansions centers on.
Yeah, well, she could become the speaker for Azeroth in terms of like how players interact with Azeroth too. Obviously Magni, he's done. He's not going to do his whole talking to Azeroth anymore stuff. So maybe she does. Also, I guess we can directly communicate with her now since the song has gotten louder technically. Now she talks to everybody. But she could be our interpreter, trying to understand what Azeroth is saying and all that.
Now, we've also got a solid idea of what their home looks like. Here's the story in that. Just after the old gods were locked up, Elune and the Titan Aeonar planted a world tree named Eluna here. Now, it did a stellar job of healing the void corruption that was around the place, maybe in the World Soul, but Aman'Thul, the leader of the Titans, was not a fan of cooperating with a goddess of life, so he ripped the tree out. Again, think about, say, roots cracking a pavement. It just didn't fit what Aman'Thul wanted. But here's the thing for Aman'Thul. He ripped out the tree, but roots were still left below. Those roots had sank down to the World Soul itself. They couldn't be ripped out. So then Elune sent guardians to tend to those roots. Those guardians are the Haranir, and the roots are their home. You then take a look at that data mining that says Rootlands, and the whole thing sure does seem pretty damn suspicious. And we can imagine what visiting it would be like, right? A small section of some vast ecosystem spiraling down to the core of the planet. And of course, if Aman'Thul's minions were ever to get wind of the roots, that would mean war. I mean, just check out the Kobold stories about the stone men clearing out their dens because they didn't conform to order. And the point of that story is that the Earthen mindlessly followed the Titans' edicts. They actually would be the sorts of people that you would hide from. They're exactly the people that the Haranir hid from. And the Haranir, they're a serious bunch. Their traditions go hard, even in the face of all the black blood, crazy corruption stuff.
Yeah, this guy didn't want to deviate from what their traditions are. He was totally against everything that Orwena was going to do, and yet Orwena was like, she was kind of like a rebel. She's like, I got to follow this voice. There's something wrong here. And he kind of reluctantly said, all right, go do your thing, but I'm not going to follow you.
Nan and the others
they're very
left
traditional
Rowena
people.
to her quest. That's because their isolationism is so strong that fraternizing with us outsiders actually seems worse than confronting whatever the hell the Black Blood is doing.
Right.
And
by the way, if we get these guys and their racial is not the ability to turn into a bat and fly, then Blizzard missed the mark there. This has to be their racial.
seems worse than confronting whatever the hell the Black Blood is doing. And if there is a plot line to focus on, it sure as hell is the blood. The Black Blood is a strange thing. It's defined this expansion, but without us really noticing or dealing with it properly. If you go to the bottom of Azj-Kahet, you find all of these ecologies of just stuff that's been twisted and turned. And the Black Blood...
It's also in the new Undermine zone. There's that whole Titan area where it's all Black Blood destroyed.
Looks like it's what remained of old gods. We find the Nerubians have been collecting it, and then in the campaign finale, Xal'atath says the whole point, right? The whole point of bringing us to Khazalgar was to emotion dump our anger against her into the Black Blood, which does make sense.
Right.
That's exactly what
Alex,
happened
thanks
with
for
the
the 100
remnant
bits, man.
of Yasharaj, right? That fed in our negativity in the Mists of Pandaria expansion. Now, after powering up the blood, it's of course time to harvest. And that's what brings us to patch 11.1, where we find out that goblins are harvesting that blood on an industrial scale.
Of course they are.
Plan to repair the Dark Heart after it was cracked by Illyria at the end of the campaign. So, what we have is this. Azeroth called Orwena to Khazalgar to investigate the Black Blood. At every step, she has been there to bust up harvest operations and to peel back the next layer of the mystery.
Right.
The Black Blood is an ecological and narrative time bomb to be resolved in this expansion, and its ultimate stakes are in a Rootland zone.
I agree. I think Undermine is going to talk a lot about Black Blood. Obviously, the goblins delving into it. We even saw some riggings where some of the mounts are being run on Black Blood. If you've seen, I mean, I just showed it the other day, and there's no way I'll find it right now. But there was the big mech suit mount that you'll be able to get, and running through all the piping of it is Black Blood. So the goblins are obviously using this shit, which means we're going to get more into the lore behind it, figure out what it actually is, where it came from, old god-esque stuff, and the story behind it all, and why Xal'atath cares about it too.
This fits that data mining. So we can imagine part of the zone being serene and gorgeous, but the rest of it being twisted into some sort of purple horror. Perhaps with the Haranir Elders powerless to hold it back until we turn up. Is the Black Blood, is this enough material for the War Within's final patch? Especially when we consider that the end of this expansion is what catapults us into the thick of the World Soul saga. And of course I say that because Chris Metzen came back whenever the War Within was significantly into production. The whole World Soul saga thing only really happened after that point, which means that the War Within has been bent towards the World Soul Saga arc, but the expansions that are 100%
another death.
Bald ass, red Canadian ass bitch. Thank you for the sub by kicking off that hype train, Cadence. I appreciate it. 22 months of being a Death Knight of our skirt. Jesus.
made with it in mind are Midnight and the
What
Last
a
Titan.
champ.
So if there ever was a time to go
Sorry
hard
about
to
your
launch
Chiefs.
us into those expansions, it would be the final patch. And if I was doing this video 1 month ago, I would have hard called Rootlands as patch 11.2. But then the content of Undermine actually changed my mind, and now I'm not sure.
Ew.
If you remember back to the prologue of this expansion, Locust Walker warned us that his own planet, Kesh, sang a radiant song shortly before Dimensius manifested and consumed the planet. This was, of course, a message directed straight at us, the players, telling us that Dimensius was coming, that there's a place called Kesh, which, I mean, we already knew about, but this was Blizzard kind of relitigating it and making it relevant again in the modern lore. And with Locust Walker's dialogue, they went so
This
far...
cinematic was like so HD. Something about it was very cool. I don't know what it is visually. It's just a very striking cinematic, and obviously very important too. Just the way he refers to Xal'atath, like he knew her previously, or maybe she was like one of them at some point. I have no idea, but it's very interesting, the ethereal relationship with Xal'atath.
As to directly tie Xal'atath into the whole thing, because it's clear that those two characters have got history. Why would Blizzard do any of that with Kesh?
I think Queen Ensarek is dead. I do think she's dead. I'm not sure, you know, we didn't see her die in the cinematic or anything like that, but I'm pretty sure her health hits 0, and she dies, so I don't think she continues on from here.
Unless they were actually planning to do something with it. And right now the assumption is that Xal'atath is working towards the same thing that happened to Kesh, but to us and our planet. And that work that she's doing continues in patch 11.1 and with patch 11.1.5, which is called Nightfall. Again, Nightfall, the thing that happens before midnight. Midnight, the next expansion. But here's where it gets interesting. Very light spoilers here, but I think it's worth bringing them up. In patch 11.1, we find void-aligned Ethereals, but who are working against Xal'atath, which is pretty neat. During the Burning Crusade, the Ethereals basically sought to use the Void against Void, and we know that basically that completely failed, and at least some of them later formed the Shadow Guard. The Shadow Guard are the Void Ethereals that we have seen directly help Xal'atath, so she is working with them. So it seems then that we've got another group of void-wielding Ethereals who are opposing Xal'atath, which maybe suggests that they're some of that original group from the Burning Crusade who were our once enemies, yes, but still want to use the Void to fight the Void, which would mean that they're gunning for their ancestral enemy, the guy who basically destroyed their planet, Dimensius.
I mean, also, if you remember the Ethereals in Netherstorm, right? They're using these purple bubbles. You guys remember the giant purple bubbles? You go inside, there's like a whole ecosystem in there, plants and everything living and all that stuff. Maybe we're going to need some of their technology to be able to either survive some of the void hits that we're going to take or whatever it is. But they clearly have the ability via their magic and their knowledge to survive, hits from the void through these bubble things. So we'll see if this, if that magic actually ends up being something that's helpful to us.
Void to fight the Void, which would mean that they're gunning for their ancestral enemy, the guy who basically destroyed their planet, Dimensius. And Dimensius has been foreshadowed as a threat for the Midnight expansion. And of course, taking out Dimensius would completely align with the interests of Illyria's mentor, Locust Walker, who again is a being that we know knows Xal'atath, wields the Void, helps us, and is the guy who name-dropped the planet of Kesh, which, is kind of what we call foreshadowing. And Kesh,
I hope we go there.
Patch would be much like Argus that we had in the Legion expansion, the ruins of a fallen world. So if Blizzard wants patch 11.2 to impress, to get people back before midnight, this absolutely would be the play. Let's draw this into something concrete. Scenario 1, we get minor patches handling all the Black Blood and Rootland stuff, and patch 11.2 is Kesh. Scenario 2, I'd say that would be 11.2 is the Rootlands. We would get minor patches as we would expect, where the Ethereals remain in the background and the lore slowly builds up, with Kesh perhaps being patch 12.1. Maybe that's what fully injects the Cosmic Void into the Midnight expansion, setting
more
the stakes
likely
for the final patch of Midnight. But either way, to be honest with you, it sounds pretty good. If we get either of these zones, I'll be happy. And if you would like more Ethereals, watch this next.
Yeah, I think the more likely of the two is we deal with the Rootlands first in this expansion, and then the lead up into the Midnight expansion will be all this Kesh stuff with all the Ethereals and everything else. That's most likely how it'll happen and play out. And I'm fine with that. The story actually sounds interesting. I'm excited to play through it.